the deadliest places humans call home. What would drive you to raise your children in a place where the average lifespan is 15 years shorter than the rest of your country? Or build your home where the ground beneath you could open up without warning? Living in these extreme environments is like walking a high wire with no safety net. Every step demands resilience and courage. Today, we're diving into the world's most lethal territories through the eyes of those who endure them. From disease-ravaged regions in Central Africa to the frozen extremes of Oymyakon, Russia, we'll uncover how humans survive in places where life itself hangs by a thread. The perfect storm. Central Africa's disease vulnerability. When we look at a map of the world's most dangerous disease hotspots, Central Africa stands out like a biological warning sign. The Congo Basin region is a unique ecological pressure cooker where geography, climate, and biodiversity combine to create the perfect conditions for deadly pathogens to emerge and spread. Spanning countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, and parts of Uganda, this region's environment is shaped by an intricate combination of factors. Central Africa's position along the equator creates a consistently hot, humid climate, with temperatures ranging from 24 to 30 degrees Celsius year-round and humidity levels often exceeding 80%. This perpetual warmth and moisture act as an incubator for microorganisms, allowing viruses and bacteria to replicate and mutate at accelerated rates compared to cooler, drier regions. Adding to this, the Congo Basin is home to some of Earth's most diverse ecosystems, containing approximately 20% of all known plant and animal species. The rainforest alone spans over 1.5 million square miles, making it the second largest tropical forest in the world. This extraordinary biodiversity provides countless opportunities for pathogens to adapt and evolve, jumping between animal hosts before potentially infecting humans. Imagine it as a vast, interconnected web where every species plays a role in the survival and transmission of these microorganisms. Satellite imagery reveals a complex mosaic of dense forests, rivers, wetlands, and human settlements. These interface zones, where humans and wildlife live in close proximity, are hotspots for pathogen spillover. For example, fruit bats, suspected reservoirs of Ebola, often feed on fruit trees near villages. When they drop partially eaten fruit or excrete near areas where humans gather food, the virus finds opportunities to cross species. This convergence of human and animal activity creates a perfect storm for disease emergence. The Congo River and its tributaries, forming one of the world's most extensive river systems with over 10,000 miles of navigable waterways, further amplify the risk. These rivers are lifelines for transportation, fishing, and water, but they also act as highways for disease transmission, connecting remote villages to larger population centers. Waterborne pathogens can spread rapidly along these routes, turning isolated outbreaks into regional crises. Central Africa's disease profile is particularly alarming due to the prevalence of zoonotic diseases, those that jump from animals to humans. The region has been the origin of some of humanity's most feared viral hemorrhagic fevers. Ebola, for instance, emerged from the forests of northern DRC and Gabon, while Marburg virus was first identified in lab workers handling African green monkeys from Uganda. Lassa fever continues to circulate in parts of the region. Between 2018 and 2020, the DRC experienced its second-largest Ebola outbreak in history, with over 3,470 cases and 2,280 deaths. This was not an isolated event, but part of a troubling pattern that has persisted for decades. The viral families thriving in this region have evolved alongside local wildlife for millions of years. Filoviruses like Ebola and Marburg have established reservoir hosts, likely certain bat species, that carry the viruses without becoming ill. These bats roost in massive colonies throughout the forests, potentially spreading virus-laden saliva and excrement to other animals and, occasionally, humans. During dry seasons, when fruit becomes scarce, bats concentrate around remaining food sources, often near villages. This seasonal stress increases viral shedding precisely when human contact is most likely, creating cyclical risk patterns. The region's soil composition also plays a surprising role in disease ecology. Iron-rich laterite soils support distinct plant communities that attract specific animal species, creating microenvironments where certain pathogens can thrive. Some scientists even hypothesize that soil characteristics might influence the survival of pathogens outside their hosts, though this remains an area of active research. The diversity and lethality of pathogens in Central Africa are staggering. Ebola strains in the region have case fatality rates ranging from 25% to 90%, while Marburg virus infections can kill up to 88% of those infected. Even lesser-known pathogens like Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever can cause devastating illness, with mortality rates exceeding 30%. Researchers have identified at least 6 distinct Ebola virus species circulating in the region, each with unique properties and transmission patterns. This genetic diversity suggests a long evolutionary history within the region's ecosystems, with viral lineages that likely date back thousands of years. Climate factors further exacerbate the risks. The region's pronounced wet and dry seasons influence both wildlife behavior and human activities. During dry periods, communities may travel farther for water, increasing exposure to new environments and potential pathogens. Conversely, heavy rainfall can flood areas, displacing both wildlife and humans and forcing new interactions that wouldn't otherwise occur. These seasonal shifts create a dynamic backdrop for disease emergence. The topography of Central Africa, with its varying elevations from low-lying swamps to mountainous regions, creates distinct microclimates that support different pathogen ecosystems within relatively small areas. Outbreak patterns often follow these topographical distinctions, with certain pathogens appearing more frequently in specific elevation ranges. For example, disease surveillance data shows that disease corridors often align with natural features like river systems or forest edges, highlighting how the landscape itself shapes the spread of diseases. Perhaps most concerning is the likelihood that Central Africa harbors numerous pathogens science has yet to identify. Virologists estimate that less than 1% of the viral diversity in nature has been discovered. The Congo Basin's rich ecosystems almost certainly contain unknown viruses with pandemic potential, biological time bombs waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The region's history underscores its global impact. HIV, which has killed approximately 32 million people worldwide, originated here when a simian immunodeficiency virus jumped from chimpanzees to humans in southeastern Cameroon, likely in the early 20th century. What began as a localized spillover eventually became one of history's deadliest pandemics, demonstrating how pathogens from this region can have far-reaching consequences. Central Africa's disease ecology can be seen as a complex equation. Extraordinary biodiversity, favorable climate conditions, extensive water systems, and increasing human-wildlife interfaces combine to create unparalleled potential for disease emergence. No other region on Earth combines these factors with the same intensity, making it a focal point for understanding and addressing global health risks. The chainsaw effect. How deforestation unleashes deadly pathogens. Deep in Central Africa's rainforests, viruses and pathogens have existed in relative isolation for millennia. The dense canopies and intact ecosystems created natural boundaries that kept diseases contained within animal populations. But human activity is tearing down these biological barriers piece by piece, unleashing pathogens that were once safely sequestered in the wilderness. Satellite imagery from NASA reveals a stark reality. The Congo Basin has lost over 620,000 square kilometers of forest since 1990, an area larger than France. When overlaid with maps of Ebola outbreaks during the same period, nearly 80% occurred within 50 kilometers of significant deforestation zones. This is no coincidence. Deforestation acts like chainsaws cutting through nature's firewall, dismantling the protective barriers that once kept diseases in check. When forests are fragmented, the edges where wilderness meets human activity become hotspots for disease transmission. These edge effects disrupt the balance of intact ecosystems, where diseases typically remain confined to their host species. Logging roads and agricultural clearings carve transition zones into the forest, creating spaces where humans and wildlife collide. A 2018 study in Frontiers in Veterinary Science found that human-wildlife interactions in these zones multiply dramatically. In one example, a rural village that previously recorded 2 to 3 wildlife encounters per month saw that number jump to 15 to 20 after deforestation began. Each encounter represents a new opportunity for pathogens to leap across species. Bats, particularly fruit bats of the Pteropodidae family, are a key reservoir for many of Central Africa's deadliest viruses. Normally, these bats roost high in the forest canopy, far from human activity. But as logging roads penetrate deeper into forests, bats are forced to seek food elsewhere, often congregating in fruit trees near villages and farms. This shift brings them into closer contact with humans, increasing the risk of viral spillover. Primates face similar disruptions. The western lowland gorilla population has declined by 60% in recent decades due to habitat loss. As their feeding grounds disappear, gorillas and chimpanzees raid human crops more frequently, creating direct transmission pathways for simian viruses, including hemorrhagic fever strains. These encounters are no longer rare, but part of a growing pattern of human-wildlife conflict. Rodents, too, thrive in disturbed environments. Forest fragmentation reduces rodent diversity by 40%, while certain species, like the African soft-furred rat, known to carry Lassa fever, experience population explosions. These rats often invade grain stores in rural homes, bringing pathogens directly into human living spaces. Hunting practices further amplify these risks. Logging roads, which open up previously inaccessible forest interiors, have transformed traditional hunting patterns. A single logging concession in northern Congo created 3,000 kilometers of new roads between 2005 and 2015, providing easy access to remote areas. Hunters now process far more animals than before, often for commercial bushmeat markets rather than local subsistence. This shift has turned what was once a localized activity into a multi-million-dollar industry, with urban demand driving the trade. Bushmeat handling creates direct pathways for disease transmission. In market surveys across Central Africa, researchers found that 65% of meat handlers had cuts or sores on their hands while processing carcasses. Blood and bodily fluid exposure is routine during butchering, which often takes place in open-air markets without protective equipment. The butchering process itself is fraught with risks. Hunters are exposed to blood, saliva, cerebrospinal fluid, and digestive tract contents while field dressing animals. These fluids can carry deadly pathogens, including Ebola. Modern hunting methods exacerbate the problem. Where spears or traps once killed animals cleanly, shotguns now create infected wound channels. A study in PLOS neglected tropical diseases found that primates hunted with guns were 3 times more likely to test positive for transmissible viruses compared to those taken by traditional methods. Meanwhile, smoking bushmeat, a common preservation method, often fails to reach internal temperatures needed to neutralize viruses. Researchers have even isolated viable Ebola virus particles from smoked bushmeat samples. Deforestation doesn't just alter animal behavior, it reshapes entire ecosystems. Normally, different species maintain spatial separation in intact forests. But habitat loss forces animals into closer proximity around remaining resources. Researchers have documented bats, rodents, and primates sharing the same fruiting trees near forest edges, a phenomenon rarely observed in undisturbed areas. These unnatural gatherings create opportunities for pathogens to mix and mutate. The frequency of spillover events correlates directly with forest disturbance levels. Areas with 10 to 30% deforestation see double the zoonotic disease emergence rate compared to intact forests. In regions with over 30% forest loss, the rate quadruples. Secondary effects of deforestation, like soil erosion and stagnant water pools, further compound the problem. These pools become breeding grounds for mosquitoes, contributing to malaria resurgence in some areas, with infection rates rising by up to 40% after recent logging. The timber industry also plays a role beyond creating access roads. Logging camps, often housing hundreds of workers in close quarters with poor sanitation, have become initial outbreak epicenters. Several Ebola outbreaks have been traced back to such camps near the Republic of Congo-Gabon border. Meanwhile, agricultural expansion into deforested areas creates permanent interface zones. Oil palm plantations, in particular, attract certain bat species while eliminating biodiversity buffers. Similar agricultural patterns in Asia have been linked to Nipah virus outbreaks, raising concerns about Central Africa's expanding plantations. Urban sprawl adds another layer of risk. The population of Kisangani, DRC, has grown 300% since 1980, with new neighborhoods encroaching on former forest lands. City residents now encounter wildlife regularly, from bats roosting in urban fruit trees to monkeys raiding backyard gardens. These interactions, once rare, are becoming part of daily life. Disease surveillance struggles to keep pace with these changes. Health monitoring systems, designed for traditional settlement patterns, often fail to detect outbreaks early in mobile populations traveling along logging roads. By the time an outbreak is identified, it may have already spread considerable distances. The speed of deforestation outpaces scientific understanding. Researchers are still documenting species and relationships in Central Africa's forests, even as these ecosystems disappear. Some potential reservoir species may have gone extinct before their role in disease ecology could be studied, taking with them critical clues about emerging threats. Policy responses have been slow to address the root causes. Conservation laws often exist on paper but lack enforcement. In rural areas, bushmeat provides 80% of protein intake, making outright bans impractical. Solutions must balance forest protection with alternative livelihoods and food sources. Some communities have adapted traditional practices to reduce risks, such as reviving taboos against hunting certain bat species during peak viral shedding seasons. Others have modified butchering techniques after outreach programs explained disease transmission risks without challenging cultural foundations. International attention tends to focus on outbreaks after they occur, rather than preventing the conditions that lead to spillover. Yet every dollar spent on forest protection could save $7 to $20 in future outbreak response costs, according to mathematical models. Central Africa's combination of extraordinary biodiversity, rapid forest loss, and weak health infrastructure creates a perfect storm for emerging pathogens. Where forests once served as nature's containment zones, human development has opened Pandora's box. Villages on the edge. Mapping vulnerability factors. In Central Africa's disease-prone regions, two villages less than 10 kilometers apart can experience completely different outbreak outcomes. One may suffer dozens of deaths from Ebola, while the other records no cases. This disparity stems from measurable factors that make some communities far more vulnerable than others. Epidemiologists now use vulnerability mapping to identify these high-risk zones before outbreaks occur, analyzing an intricate web of environmental, social, and infrastructural elements. Take the real-world example of two villages in Equateur Province, Democratic Republic of Congo. During the 2018 Ebola outbreak, Village A recorded 43 cases with 38 fatalities, while Village B, just 5 kilometers away, had only 2 non-fatal cases. The differences in their outcomes trace back to concrete factors. Village A was located along a newly constructed logging road that cut through prime bat habitat, while Village B sat farther from forest edges. Village A drew water from a shallow creek where animals also drank, while Village B used a protected spring. These seemingly minor environmental differences created vastly different risk profiles. Proximity to disturbed forests remains one of the strongest predictors of outbreak vulnerability. Communities near recent deforestation show significantly higher outbreak rates. For example, villages within 3 kilometers of forest edges experience 4 times the outbreak rates of those farther away. Satellite analysis reveals that 73% of Ebola outbreaks since 2000 originated in these high-risk zones, which contain only 28% of the regional population. This stark contrast highlights how environmental changes can amplify risks for certain communities. Water sources tell another part of the story. Villages relying on unprotected surface water, rivers, ponds, or shallow wells, experience nearly double the outbreak rates of those with protected water systems. During the 2017 Marburg outbreak in eastern DRC, investigators traced 22 cases directly to a single riverbank where infected bats roost. The same water source served as a drinking supply, laundry site, and bathing area for multiple villages. This example underscores how shared, unprotected water sources can act as transmission hubs. Transportation routes also play a critical role in disease spread. Outbreaks move along trucking routes 40% faster than through areas with limited transport networks. Market towns serving as regional hubs are particularly vulnerable. One superspreader event in a busy market can seed infections across an entire district. Road quality matters too. Villages connected by paved roads see faster outbreak progression than those reachable only by footpaths, with the virus moving at about 7.3 kilometers per day along paved routes versus 2.1 kilometers along dirt trails. These transportation networks create invisible highways for pathogens, linking distant communities in ways that amplify outbreaks. Population density amplifies these geographic risks. Compact villages with household spacing under 15 meters experience case clusters at 3 times the rate of more spread-out settlements. In one documented case, a single Ebola patient in a densely packed neighborhood led to 17 secondary infections within 2 weeks. The same index case in a village with wider spacing produced only 3 secondary cases. Housing materials also play a role. Outbreaks spread faster in communities where over 60% of homes have dirt floors compared to those with concrete or wooden flooring. Small changes in infrastructure can make a life-or-death difference. For instance, one village in North Kivu, DRC, reduced its vulnerability by switching from shared water sources to protected wells and introducing household-specific latrines. Within 2 years, the village saw a 60% drop in waterborne disease cases and avoided secondary infections during a nearby Ebola outbreak. This example illustrates how targeted interventions can transform a community's risk profile, turning abstract mapping concepts into tangible survival strategies. Building layouts also influence transmission dynamics. Compounds with shared cooking areas show outbreak attack rates of 45%, versus 22% in villages where families prepare meals separately. Similarly, the practice of multiple families sharing a single latrine correlates with a 37% higher secondary infection rate compared to villages with household-specific facilities. These patterns emerged clearly during the 2019 Ebola outbreak in North Kivu, where transmission mapping showed infections radiating outward from shared community spaces. Traditional burial practices represent one of the most significant cultural risk factors. Funerals where mourners wash or touch the body account for approximately 60% of Ebola superspreader events. In one 2014 funeral in Guinea, a single event led to 85 subsequent cases. Other traditional practices, like communal nursing of the sick and healing ceremonies involving shared bodily fluids, similarly accelerate transmission. These cultural factors highlight the delicate balance between respecting traditions and implementing safe practices during outbreaks. Certain demographic factors also shape vulnerability. Women ages 30 to 50 face disproportionate risk, likely due to their roles as caregivers and primary handlers of the dead in many communities. Children under 5 account for less than 10% of primary cases, but show higher secondary transmission rates due to close caregiver contact. Elderly individuals face higher mortality, but often lower transmission rates, possibly because they interact with fewer people. Market networks create biological connections between seemingly separate communities. Through radio collar tracking of market women in northern DRC, researchers found the average village connects commercially with 7 others in a typical week. This means an outbreak in one village can potentially seed infections in several others within days, even if they're dozens of kilometers apart. Certain high-traffic goods, particularly used clothing and recycled containers, have been implicated in multiple cross-village transmission chains. Traditional healers act as both risk amplifiers and mitigators. When healers incorporate protective measures like glove use during treatments, they can reduce outbreak spread. However, those practicing traditional bloodletting or scarification have initiated several documented transmission chains. In one 2012 outbreak, a single healer treating patients in 5 villages became the nexus for 31 secondary cases before being identified. Predictive models now incorporate over 30 different variables to create community vulnerability scores. These include measurable factors like distance to forest edges, latrine coverage percentages, market connection density, and traditional healer practice frequencies. High-resolution satellite imagery helps track dynamic changes, like new logging roads or settlement expansion, that can shift a village's risk profile between monitoring cycles. The complexity of these interacting factors explains why simple preventive measures often fail. Hand-washing stations help, but not if the water source itself is contaminated by upstream wildlife. Isolation units prove ineffective if traditional healers continue unsafe practices unchecked. Vaccination campaigns miss their mark if teams don't account for seasonal population movements. True prevention requires understanding each community's unique vulnerability profile and addressing all critical failure points medical resources don't exist. When fever strikes in rural Equateur Province, Democratic Republic of Congo, the journey to diagnosis begins with an impossible choice. A family notices their father developing symptoms: headache, fatigue, vomiting. In a region where malaria is endemic, these signs could mean anything. But if it's something more dangerous like Ebola, every hour matters. The nearest health post is 35 kilometers away, down a forest footpath. The journey takes at least 8 hours on foot. For many families, leaving crops and livestock unattended to make this trek feels like gambling their survival on uncertain medical help. The Democratic Republic of Congo has just 0.3 physicians per 10,000 people, compared to 26 per 10,000 in the United States. This means one doctor might serve 30,000 residents across 100 villages. When the father finally reaches the health post, he'll likely find an overwhelmed nurse or community health worker instead of a doctor. The facility will probably lack electricity, running water, and basic diagnostic tools. Malaria tests might be available, but testing for hemorrhagic fevers often requires sending samples to distant labs, a process that can take days or weeks. This delay has devastating consequences. If the father has Ebola, studies show he became contagious about 3 days before showing symptoms. During the early fever stage, when he could still walk, he likely infected 2 people per day through normal household contact. By the time he becomes bedridden, when families typically seek help, he may have already transmitted the virus to 6 others. Each of those secondary cases faces the same delayed path to diagnosis, creating an exponentially growing chain of transmission, while health workers remain unaware an outbreak has begun. Medical supply chains in these regions operate on razor-thin margins. A typical rural clinic stocks just enough gloves, masks, and disinfectants for routine care. One Ebola patient can deplete an entire facility's monthly supply of protective gear in 3 days. When stocks run out, as they did during the 2018 Ecuador outbreak, health workers face a grim choice: abandon infected patients or risk unprotected exposure. Neither option stops the disease from spreading. Transport limitations worsen every other healthcare gap. When the father's condition deteriorates and he needs hospitalization, his village has no vehicles for safe medical transport. Family members might carry him on a makeshift stretcher for hours, exposing themselves to infectious bodily fluids. Even if they reach a referral hospital, intensive care capacity is almost non-existent. Of 435 hospitals surveyed across 5 Central African countries in 2021, only 7 had functioning ventilators. Most lacked consistent oxygen supplies. Diagnostic capabilities are similarly limited. District hospitals serving populations of 500,000 might have one functional microscope and basic lab equipment for common diseases. Few can test for specialized conditions. During the 2017 Marburg outbreak in Uganda, suspected patient samples traveled 300 kilometers to the Uganda Virus Research Institute. Results took 4 days under ideal conditions, an eternity during an outbreak. By the time confirmation arrives, the virus often establishes multiple transmission chains. Supply chain failures create predictable crises. Vaccines requiring refrigeration often arrive ineffective after days in broken coolers. A 2020 study of vaccine cold chains in the DRC found that 40% of temperature-sensitive medications were compromised before reaching end users. For Ebola, this waste means fewer people develop immunity through ring vaccination campaigns, leaving entire communities vulnerable. Surveillance systems designed to catch outbreaks early often miss critical signals. Most health posts submit paper reports collected monthly by motorcycle couriers. Data entry delays mean district health offices might process April's disease reports in June. By the time analysts notice unusual case clusters, hundreds of exposures could have occurred. Modern electronic systems cover only about 15% of health facilities in the region, primarily in urban areas. Traditional healers fill gaps in formal healthcare access, with complex implications for outbreak control. Approximately 70% of rural residents consult traditional practitioners before seeking biomedical care. Some healers have adopted safer practices, like using gloves during treatments. Others continue high-risk procedures like bloodletting with unsterilized tools. During the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak, such practices significantly contributed to disease spread before interventions engaged healers as partners. Maternal health care shortages create additional risks. In areas with one midwife serving 50,000 people, most births occur at home without sterile equipment. If Ebola strikes a pregnant woman, traditional birth attendants assisting her face extreme exposure risks from blood and amniotic fluids. This dynamic drove high infection rates among women aged 25 to 45 in multiple Central African outbreaks. Mental health care is almost entirely absent. A 2019 survey found that the entire DRC, with 90 million people, had 12 practicing psychiatrists. Outbreaks leave traumatized communities without psychological support. Survivors face stigma. Children orphaned by disease lack counseling, and health workers battling burnout have no mental health resources. These untreated traumas can undermine community resilience for generations. The financial burden of seeking care often proves insurmountable. Though many countries nominally offer free health care for epidemic diseases, patients still bear transportation costs, food expenses during hospitalization, and lost income. A 2018 study found that rural families spend an average of 34% of their monthly income accessing emergency medical care, an impossible barrier for the poorest. Community health workers form the fragile backbone of the system. These minimally trained villagers provide frontline care with extremely limited resources. During outbreaks, they take on dangerous tasks like contact tracing without adequate protective gear. Turnover is high. After the 2018 to 2020 Ebola outbreak in DRC, 60% of trained community health workers left their positions due to burnout and trauma. Regional disparities create pockets of extreme vulnerability. Conflict zones like eastern DRC see complete collapse of health systems, with armed groups often looting medical facilities. Remote areas like the Central African Republic savanna regions have virtually no permanent health infrastructure. Meanwhile, capital cities concentrate most resources. Kinshasa hosts 65% of DRC's physicians while housing only 13% of its population. Emergency referral systems function inconsistently at best. District hospitals meant to receive critical cases often lack ambulances or fuel to retrieve patients. During the 2020 measles outbreak in DRC, investigators documented cases where children died waiting 8 days for transport to hospitals just 50 kilometers away. Similar delays have occurred with Ebola, Lassa fever, and other time-sensitive conditions. Infrastructure deficiencies undermine even well-supplied facilities. Approximately 60% of rural health centers lack reliable water access, making infection control nearly impossible. Electricity outages spoil medications and disable equipment. A 2021 assessment in northern DRC found that 70% of donated laboratory equipment sat unused due to power inconsistencies and lack of maintenance capacity. These systemic gaps create predictable crisis patterns. Initial cases go undetected due to surveillance lags. Limited diagnostics delay confirmation. Shortages of isolation beds, protective gear, and trained staff accelerate nosocomial spread. Transportation failures prevent timely interventions. Treatment limitations push mortality rates higher than necessary. The cascading effect transforms containable clusters into runaway outbreaks. The human cost is staggering. Case fatality rates for Ebola hover around 50% in well-resourced treatment centers. In healthcare deserts, they can exceed 80%. For measles, a vaccine-preventable disease, mortality in Central African outbreaks reaches up to 25% compared to 0.2% in developed nations. These disparities show how weak health systems multiply the deadliness of pathogens. Some communities have developed stopgap solutions. Motorcycle ambulances now serve some remote areas, cutting evacuation times. Solar-powered refrigerators help maintain vaccine cold chains. Community surveillance networks using basic mobile phones improve outbreak reporting speeds. But these innovations reach only fractions of vulnerable populations. The fundamental issue remains: healthcare deserts don't just lack resources, they lack systems to deploy them effectively. A single Ebola treatment center requires not just tents and medicines, but reliable supply chains, trained staff, and community engagement. Building this capacity temporarily during crises cannot substitute for permanent infrastructure. When outbreak strikes, the first 30 days. Day 1. A quiet morning in a small village near the Congo River. A hunter returns from the forest, his steps heavy with fatigue. He complains of a mild fever, nothing unusual after days in the wilderness. His wife prepares bitter herbs for the fever and mixes palm wine with roots for strength. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke as the family gathers for the evening meal. No one suspects this is more than a routine illness. Day 3. The hunter's fever worsens, and a rash appears on his arms. His family, believing bad spirits are to blame, calls a traditional healer. The healer performs cleansing rituals, sharing cups of medicinal water and laying hands on the hunter. 5 family members are now exposed to whatever illness he carries. Day 5. The hunter's condition deteriorates rapidly. His sister arrives with her children to help care for him. The village health worker, a farmer with minimal medical training, visits but lacks the tools to diagnose anything unusual. Suspecting severe malaria, he administers injections using the only syringe available at the crumbling health post. By the end of the day, 5 more patients will receive injections with the same needle. The hunter's sister returns to her village 3 kilometers away, unaware she's already carrying the pathogen. Day 7. The hunter dies overnight. According to tradition, his family washes his body for burial. 27 relatives participate in the funeral rites, passing a shared cloth to wipe his face and hands. The air is thick with the scent of incense and mourning. No one realizes this act will spread the infection across multiple households. 3 other villagers now report similar symptoms, but the hunter's death is attributed to witchcraft. At the district health office, 40 kilometers away, staff remain unaware as they process last month's paperwork. Day 10. The crisis deepens. 6 funeral attendees now show symptoms, including a midwife who has delivered 2 babies since the burial. Supplies at the health post are exhausted, and the nurse sends a runner to the nearest town, a 2-day journey, for more. Meanwhile, the hunter's sister lies bedridden in her village, her fever climbing. A local healer treats her with scarification, using an unsterilized blade to rub herbal preparations into small cuts. Day 12. Rumors begin to swirl. Some villagers claim foreign aid workers poisoned the water. Others whisper about government experiments. Fear spreads as a mobile clinic arrives, its staff wearing full protective gear, alien-looking suits that terrify the community. Attempts to collect samples are met with resistance. Families hide sick relatives, fearing hospitals will harm them. Trust erodes just as the number of cases begins to rise sharply. Day 14. Healthcare workers are among the first casualties. At the district hospital, a doctor examines a screaming child with hemorrhagic symptoms without gloves. The supply room is locked, and the keys are missing. Within days, 3 nurses and 2 cleaners from that shift fall ill. The hospital, lacking isolation facilities, continues to operate as usual. Infected staff unknowingly expose maternity patients and surgical cases. One nurse, feeling unwell, travels 70 kilometers to visit family, unknowingly spreading the pathogen to a new district. Day 15. Over 30 confirmed cases are reported across 4 villages, though the true number is likely much higher. Traditional leaders hold a crisis meeting, rejecting government advice to limit gatherings. At the same meeting, they decide to send 3 symptomatic elders to a renowned healer in a neighboring province. The men travel by crowded minibus, stopping at markets along the way. By the end of the month, health investigators will trace 42 cases back to this single journey. Day 18. Supply chains buckle under the strain. Emergency PPE arrives at the regional capital but sits at the airstrip for 3 days, delayed by customs clearance. Local markets sell out of bleach and soap as panicked residents hoard supplies. Fuel shortages prevent ambulances from reaching critical cases. One family, desperate, carries their dying mother 20 kilometers to the hospital on a makeshift plywood stretcher, exposing dozens along the way as they stop for water and assistance. Day 20. Misinformation spreads faster than the disease. A viral radio broadcast claims eating raw onions prevents infection, causing the price of onions to quadruple. Another rumor alleges hospitals harvest organs from the dead, prompting families to hide bodies. Community health workers attempting door-to-door education face hostility, with some pelted with stones. These challenges echo real events from the 2019 DRC Ebola outbreak, where responders recorded over 300 attacks in a single year. Day 22. The outbreak's true scale becomes clear. Laboratory tests finally confirm the pathogen, a novel virus. Economic aftershocks. When disease destroys livelihoods. When a deadly disease sweeps through Central African communities, the economic devastation often outlasts the outbreak itself. In regions where most families survive on less than $2 a day, the 3 months of an average Ebola or Mpox outbreak can trigger economic shocks that persist for decades. During active outbreaks, regional economies contract by an average of 30% within the first 8 weeks. Markets that normally bustle with hundreds of traders sit empty after quarantine measures take effect. A study tracking 40 villages during the 2018 Equator Ebola outbreak found market activity dropped to 12% of pre-outbreak levels. Food prices spike as transportation networks freeze. During one measles outbreak in DRC, cassava flour prices tripled within 4 weeks. Agriculture suffers. Immediate losses when farmers fall ill or abandon fields. In pox-affected regions, up to 60% of farming households report losing at least one working-age adult to illness during outbreaks. Key planting and harvest windows get missed. Rice farmers in one affected area produced only 35% of their typical yield after an outbreak disrupted the growing season. Abandoned fields quickly become overgrown. Reclaiming them requires labor most communities lack post-outbreak. Livestock losses compound the crisis. When herders die or become too ill to work, cattle and goats often perish from neglect. The 2019 Ebola outbreak in eastern DRC destroyed an estimated 40% of the region's small ruminant population, a devastating loss given that a single goat represents about 2 months' income for most families. Trade restrictions amplify these losses. Neighboring districts and countries quickly close borders to affected regions, severing economic ties that took generations to build. Cross-border trade in commodities like coffee, palm oil, and charcoal, which normally accounts for 25 to 40% of local GDP in these areas, grinds to a halt. Even after official restrictions lift, stigma lingers. Traders often avoid goods from outbreak zones for months afterward, fearing contamination. The economic toll is not just about numbers, it's about lives. Take the story of Jean, a cassava farmer in Equator province. Before the 2018 Ebola outbreak, Jean's family earned enough from their small plot to send his 2 daughters to school. But when the outbreak hit, Jean fell ill, and his fields were left untended. By the time he recovered, the cassava had rotted, and his family had sold their only goat to pay for transportation to the treatment center. With no savings and no harvest, Jean's daughters dropped out of school to help the family survive. Stories like Jean's are tragically common, illustrating how quickly an outbreak can unravel years of hard work. The education disruption creates longer-term economic damage. School closures during outbreaks average 82 days in affected areas, equivalent to losing an entire academic year when accounting for subsequent attendance declines. Before the 2010 pox outbreak in Central African Republic, only 23% of children in affected villages could read basic sentences. Post-outbreak testing showed that figure dropped to 11% as families prioritized survival over schooling. These educational losses translate directly into reduced future earnings. Economists tracking the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak found affected children ultimately completed 1.5 fewer years of schooling on average. When these children entered the workforce, they earned 25% less than peers from unaffected regions, a lifetime earnings gap exceeding $20,000 per person in local purchasing power. Healthcare expenses devastate family finances. Even when treatment for epidemic diseases is nominally free, families still bear substantial costs. Transport to distant treatment centers averages $75 per trip, more than 2 months' income for most households. Burial expenses for those who don't survive consume another $100 to $150 when accounting for coffins, funeral meals, and ceremonial requirements. Families resort to desperate measures to cover these costs. In one surveyed group of mpox-affected households, 68% sold productive assets like farming tools or sewing machines, 42% withdrew children from school permanently to save fees, 31% took high-interest loans from informal lenders, 19% arranged underage marriages for daughters to secure bride prices. These coping strategies create poverty traps that persist for years. Families that sell assets lose future income-generating capacity. Children removed from school face permanently depressed earnings potential. Debt burdens accumulate. After the 2018 Ebola outbreak in DRC, 63% of surveyed households still carried outbreak-related debts 18 months later. Local businesses face their own death spiral. The typical outbreak-affected community sees 30 to 40% of small enterprises close permanently. Those that remain open operate at reduced capacity. A study in North Kivu found surviving businesses took an average of 14 months to regain pre-outbreak sales levels. Skilled workers leave affected areas in droves. One Liberian town lost 80% of its carpenters and masons after the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Food security deteriorates rapidly as production and distribution networks fail. The World Food Programme estimates outbreak-affected households experience a 57% reduction in daily caloric intake on average. Childhood malnutrition rates typically double within 6 months of an outbreak start, a condition with lifelong cognitive and physical consequences that further limit future economic potential. The economic aftershocks extend far beyond the outbreak zone. Neighboring regions that rely on affected areas for labor migration or raw materials suffer secondary impacts. A rubber plantation in southern Cameroon lost 40% of its seasonal workforce during the 2018 DRC Ebola outbreak, as workers feared traveling through outbreak areas. This created ripple effects in workers' home villages that depended on plantation wages. Longitudinal studies show these economic wounds never fully heal. Communities affected by the 1995 Kikwit Ebola outbreak still had 22% lower per capita incomes compared to control villages 15 years later. Children born during outbreak years show stunted growth patterns persisting into adulthood, a biological marker of chronic economic stress with associated reductions in cognitive ability and earnings potential. Perhaps most tragically, outbreaks erase decades of fragile economic progress in mere months. One carefully studied village in Gabon had achieved steady poverty reduction through cocoa farming from 1990 to 2001. Until an Ebola outbreak killed 25% of working-age adults. Within 2 years, 83% of households fell back below the poverty line, where most remain today. The village's sole cocoa processing facility never reopened. The economic devastation becomes self-perpetuating. Impoverished communities invest less in health and sanitation, creating conditions ripe for the next outbreak. Malnourished populations show weaker immune responses to infections. Children deprived of education grow into adults less able to implement disease prevention measures. This vicious cycle explains why certain regions experience recurrent outbreaks every 5 to 7 years, just as they begin to recover economically from the last one. The fundamental tragedy lies in how outbreaks trap entire generations in poverty. A child born during an outbreak year faces compounding disadvantages: reduced nutrition during critical development windows, interrupted education, diminished career prospects, and heightened exposure to future outbreaks. Their children, in turn, inherit these limitations. Economic modeling suggests it takes 3 generations for affected families to regain social fracture when communities break apart. In small villages across Central Africa, social bonds form the foundation of daily life. Families live in interconnected compounds, sharing harvests and childcare responsibilities. Elders resolve disputes, while young people contribute labor according to traditional roles. Markets serve as social hubs where news circulates alongside goods. Religious ceremonies mark life's transitions from birth to death. These intricate networks sustain communities through hardship, until a deadly disease arrives and unravels them thread by thread. When infection strikes, fear reshapes human behavior in devastating ways. Neighbors who once shared meals begin avoiding eye contact. Relatives stop visiting sick family members, a shocking breach of cultural norms in societies where illness traditionally triggers communal caregiving. During the 2022 Mpox outbreak in Nigeria's Rivers State, health workers reported parents abandoning infected children at treatment centers. Spouses divorced survivors, believing them cursed. One study in eastern DRC found 40% of Ebola survivors returned home to find their marriages dissolved by panic-stricken partners. The orphan crisis exposes another layer of social breakdown. When parents die from diseases like Mpox or Ebola, extended families traditionally absorb the children, but outbreaks overwhelm this informal safety net. During the 2018 to 2020 Ebola epidemic in North Kivu, over 12,000 children lost one or both parents. Normally, aunts and uncles would care for them, but fear of contagion changes everything. Relatives refuse to take in children from infected households, despite medical assurances they pose no risk. Community health workers in Liberia reported finding Ebola orphans living alone in abandoned houses, foraging for food like wild animals. Survivors face stigma that lasts for years. Many return from hospitals branded as carriers of death. Landlords evict them. Employers refuse work. At water pumps, people scatter when they approach. A 2021 study tracking 1,200 Ebola survivors found 62% still experienced social exclusion 3 years post-recovery, over double the rate reported in the first 6 months. Psychological assessments reveal suicide rates among survivors 5 times higher than the general population. The isolation becomes self-perpetuating. Shunned individuals often relocate, only for rumors to precede them to new communities. Traditional gathering spaces transform from hubs of connection to feared infection points. Churches in Liberia saw attendance drop by 80% during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, even in unaffected regions. Market stalls stand empty as traders avoid customers from neighboring villages. Schools close not just by government order, but because parents refuse to send children. During Uganda's 2022 Mpox scare, classroom attendance plummeted even in districts with 0 cases. These abandoned spaces represent more than temporary closures. They signal the disintegration of structures that have organized social life for generations. Cultural rituals around death suffer particularly violent disruption. In Central African traditions, proper burial practices ensure the deceased's peaceful transition to the ancestral realm. Survivors believe improper rites doom souls to wander, and may bring misfortune upon the living. Yet Ebola and Mpox protocols require immediate, clinical burials in plastic body bags. In Sierra Leone, military teams reportedly seized corpses from grieving families at gunpoint during the 2014 outbreak. One traditional leader described watching health workers dump his nephew into a grave without ceremony. They treated him like trash. That memory will never leave me. The psychological trauma reshapes community identity. Where villages once proudly celebrated harvest festivals, survivors now associate those gatherings with superspreader events. Oral histories collected in Guinea reveal communities deliberately abandoning songs and dances that originated during outbreak years, burying cultural knowledge rather than preserving painful memories. Nightmares plague children who witnessed parents dying untreated. Adults describe hypervigilance, interpreting every fever as the start of another catastrophe. A counselor in Beni documented entire neighborhoods where survivors compulsively wash hands dozens of times daily, years after the last case. Intergenerational relationships fracture under the strain. Elders traditionally command respect as wisdom keepers, but outbreaks expose their extreme vulnerability. When grandparents perish in disproportionate numbers, communities lose living libraries of medicinal plants, conflict resolution techniques, and oral histories. Conversely, youth often blame elders for clinging to dangerous traditions like corpse washing. In Liberia, some villages reported young people refusing to care for elderly survivors, leaving them to starve, an unthinkable betrayal in pre-outbreak society. Gender. Roles distort under outbreak pressures. Women bear disproportionate caregiving burdens. During the DRC's 10th Ebola outbreak, 62% of fatalities were female. Yet when survivors return, husbands often abandon wives who nursed the sick, fearing residual contamination. Paradoxically, some women gain unexpected autonomy when widowed. In eastern Congo, several became village chiefs after demonstrating outbreak leadership, only to face resentment from male relatives later. Adolescent girls suffer uniquely, with school closures and parental deaths spiking early marriage rates by 30% in affected zones. The economic collapse detailed in earlier sections exacerbates social fractures. Friendship networks strain when people can no longer fulfill reciprocal labor obligations. A farmer who once helped neighbors plant fields may become a pariah when too weak from post-Ebola syndrome to reciprocate. Bride prices plummet as families avoid contaminated lineages, disrupting marriage markets for years. In Sierra Leone, some villages reported going 5 years without a single wedding ceremony post-outbreak, an unprecedented social freeze. Religious faith often takes contradictory hits. Some communities experience crisis conversions, with attendance swelling at churches promising divine protection. Others descend into spiritual despair. A Pentecostal pastor in Monrovia described conducting 30 funerals in 1 month during Ebola's peak. People asked me why God hated them. I had no answers. Traditional healers face particular suspicion. Once revered, many get blamed for spreading disease through their practices. In one Ugandan district, mobs burned 16 healers alive after rumors accused them of deliberately infecting clients. Community leadership structures crumble when trusted figures perish. The Kikwit Ebola outbreak decimated local government. 48% of civil servants in affected areas died, including judges, teachers, and administrators. Succession crises erupt when hereditary chiefs die without clear heirs. During one pox outbreak in Cameroon, 3 villages descended into violent disputes over traditional leadership that lasted years. Meanwhile, externally imposed quarantine zones erode respect for local authority. Young people especially bristle at restrictions from officials they consider outsiders. Language itself mutates under outbreak pressures. New terms emerge to describe the indescribable. Liberian English added words like eboli, someone who survived but remains suspicious, and corpse business, the dangerous but lucrative trade of smuggling bodies for traditional burials. Conversely, certain phrases disappear from polite conversation. Greeting rituals involving handshakes or hugs vanish overnight. Linguists tracking a Mano-speaking community in Guinea noted a 72% decline in terms related to physical touch 5 years post-outbreak. The Crises and pox cases in July 2024 illustrate how swiftly social fractures can emerge. When authorities confirmed infections in Uganda's border region, nearby villages immediately established informal blockades, denying entry even to healthy travelers from adjacent districts. Though medically unjustified, this reaction reflected collective trauma from previous outbreaks. One market trader described turning away long-time customers, better hungry than dead. Post-outbreak communities resemble glass shattered by sonic frequencies, externally intact but with countless invisible fissures. A mother may resume farming but never again visit her sister, who refused to take in her orphan children. A church rebuilds but avoids hymns associated with burial services. Children grow up hearing altered versions of family histories that omit how loved ones truly died. These microfractures accumulate into societal tremors that seismographs cannot measure, but anthropologists consistently document. Cultural crossroads. When tradition meets disease control. In Central African communities facing disease outbreaks, cultural traditions often collide with modern containment measures. These customs, developed over centuries, shape everything from birth rituals to funeral practices and form the foundation of community identity and resilience. When health workers arrive insisting on drastic changes, the resulting conflicts strike at the heart of how people understand themselves, their ancestors, and their connection to the world around them. The tension is most visible in three high-risk traditions: communal caregiving for the sick, burial practices, and interactions with traditional healers. These practices, like threads in a finely woven fabric, bind communities together but can unravel under the strain of disease. Communal caregiving, for instance, involves entire families gathering around an ill member, sharing food, wiping brows, and sleeping in the same room. While this provides emotional support, it also creates a direct pathway for disease transmission. During the 2019 DRC Ebola outbreak, one caregiving scenario led to 14 secondary infections from a single case, illustrating how these close-knit practices can amplify outbreaks. Burial rituals present even greater challenges. Among the Bassa people of Liberia, proper burial involves washing the body with bare hands, braiding the deceased's hair, and placing personal objects in the coffin. For the Kissi ethnic group in Guinea, improper burials are believed to trap souls between worlds, inviting disaster. These deeply held beliefs led some families to exhume bodies from official burial sites during the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Health workers enforcing impersonal burials in sealed bags often faced violent resistance. In Sierra Leone, one team was attacked with machetes while attempting to collect a corpse. These rituals, meant to honor the dead, can inadvertently spread disease, creating a painful clash between tradition and safety. Traditional healers also play a complex role in this dynamic. In rural Central Africa, 70 to 80% of people consult healers first for illnesses, reflecting both limited healthcare access and deep cultural trust. Healers use methods like herbal remedies, scarification, and spiritual cleansing, but during outbreaks, some practices, such as reusing razors or continuing hands-on treatments, can accelerate disease spread. However, healers have also proven to be valuable allies. During Uganda's 2022 Mpox outbreak, trained healers identified early cases that clinics had missed, demonstrating how integrating traditional practices with modern health measures can save lives. Community leaders often bear the heaviest burden in navigating these conflicts. Village chiefs, religious figures, and elders must balance public safety with cultural preservation, knowing that either choice risks eroding their authority. In one case, a DRC tribal leader secretly allowed a traditional burial but required participants to wear gloves, satisfying both ancestral customs and basic safety. Another leader introduced modified handshake greetings during outbreaks, replacing palm-to-palm contact with elbow taps to maintain social connection while reducing risk. Culturally adapted interventions have shown the most promise when they modify rather than prohibit traditions. For example, after initial failures during West Africa's Ebola crisis, responders developed safe and dignified burial protocols. These allowed family members to participate by selecting burial items while professionals handled the body. Families were also given photographs of the prepared corpse, a compromise that respected the need to see loved ones at rest. Compliance with these adapted practices rose from 30% to over 80% in later outbreaks, highlighting the importance of cultural sensitivity. Language choices also play a critical role in these adaptations. Early responses often used foreign terms like isolation units, which villagers associated with prisons. Later efforts reframed treatment centers as healing huts and quarantine periods as family protection time. In Liberia, health messages tied Ebola prevention to protecting ancestors' honor, aligning medical advice with existing belief systems rather than contradicting them. Religious practices required similar adjustments. Pentecostal churches in Liberia initially resisted bans on laying hands to heal the sick, a core tenet of their faith. Missionaries worked with ministers to develop alternative rituals, such as using anointing oil applied with cotton swabs. Catholic communities that traditionally shared communion wine from a single cup switched to individual disposable vessels, preserving the sacrament while reducing risk. Food traditions also posed unexpected challenges. Communal meals, where people eat from shared pots using their hands, are central to hospitality. Outreach programs trained villagers to maintain this custom safely by designating servers to use ladles and setting up hand-washing stations near dining areas. Market vendors, who often sampled goods for customers, began displaying pre-cut samples on banana leaves instead of offering direct bites. Maternal care adaptations proved especially critical. In regions where men traditionally wait outside maternity huts, requiring sick mothers to enter clinical facilities alone caused distress. Some clinics built cultural huts within hospital compounds, allowing families to remain nearby while maintaining isolation protocols. Birth attendants learned to wrap newborns in traditional patterned cloths before presenting them to relatives, preserving ceremonial aspects while limiting contact. Traditional healers have also been integrated into surveillance networks with notable success. In Uganda's Crises district, 320 healers were trained to recognize mpox symptoms and use protective gear. These healers now refer suspected cases while continuing spiritual treatments, a dual approach that locals trust more than clinical interventions alone. Monitoring showed that healer-assisted case detection rates improved by 40% compared to clinics working independently. Youth groups have emerged as unexpected cultural mediators. During the DRC's 10th Ebola outbreak, young people created skits dramatizing traditional versus medical approaches, allowing elders to see the consequences without direct confrontation. In one village, teens adapted a harvest dance to include messages about hand-washing, making hygiene education feel less like an outside imposition. The most effective adaptations respect the underlying purposes of traditions. For example, when DRC communities resisted halting traditional wrestling matches, organizers moved events outdoors, reduced audience sizes, and instituted pre-match health screenings. These changes allowed the contests to continue with 78% fewer subsequent cases than other large gatherings. Funerals remain one of the most challenging areas. Some communities now conduct soul-cleansing ceremonies after clinical burials, using symbolic items like locks of hair saved before death. Others have adapted grave-marking traditions, replacing elaborate shrines with memorial gardens at safer distances from homes. These cultural negotiations are not swift. The 2014 Ebola response took months to find workable compromises, while Uganda's 2023 mpox containment benefited from lessons learned earlier. Success depends on understanding cultural logic. People don't resist measures because they enjoy risk, but because abandoning traditions feels like losing their identity. Ultimately, the most effective disease responses don't break the cultural fabric, but work within its enduring strength. By respecting traditions and adapting interventions, public health efforts can save lives while preserving the breaking the cycle. Prevention strategies that work. Preventing deadly outbreaks in Central Africa requires stopping transmission before it begins. The difference between villages with prevention programs and those without is stark. Communities implementing layered prevention strategies see 60 to 80% fewer outbreaks compared to unprotected neighbors. This protection comes from combining early detection, behavioral changes, vaccines, and alternative livelihoods. But how do these communities catch outbreaks before they spread? Early warning systems form the first critical layer. In remote areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, community health workers monitor 120 high-risk villages using mobile reporting tools. These workers, selected from local populations, are trained to recognize early symptoms of diseases like Ebola, Mpox, and Marburg. Each worker covers about 250 people, submitting weekly health reports via simple SMS systems. When unusual cases appear, an alert triggers immediate testing. For example, this system detected the 2021 pox cluster in Sankuru province 17 days faster than previous outbreaks, allowing containment before widespread transmission. The mobile reporting technology behind these systems is surprisingly simple. Health workers use basic feature phones to input data through numbered menus. Press 1 for fever, 2 for rash, 3 for bleeding. These reports are sent to district hubs, where algorithms flag anomalies. Think of it like a neighborhood watch for diseases, local eyes on the ground, backed by technology. In Uganda's Crises district, this method identified an emerging Ebola strain in 2022 through a cluster of fever plus bleeding reports from one sub-county. Rapid confirmation and isolation prevented what could have become a multi-country outbreak. Behavior change interventions target the highest risk practices without demanding complete cultural overhaul. Hand-washing stations installed near markets and communal areas reduce transmission by 45%. The most effective designs use foot pedals to pour water, eliminating contaminated tap handles. In Liberia, stations placed near churches saw 80% usage rates after pastors incorporated hand-washing into services. Imagine attending a service where washing your hands becomes part of the ritual. Simple, yet transformative. Burial practices have also been adapted. Instead of banning traditional rituals, teams trained selected family members in safe techniques, allowing ceremonies to continue with reduced risk. Bushmeat consumption is another major risk factor, but how do you convince communities to change such a deeply ingrained practice? The answer lies in providing alternatives. Protein substitution programs in Gabon and the Republic of Congo offer fishing equipment and rabbit breeding kits to hunters. Along the Agu River, one project distributed 340 fishing boats to former hunters. Follow-up surveys showed a 72% reduction in bushmeat consumption among participants. Similarly, poultry farming initiatives paired with veterinary support have proven effective. The key is ensuring these alternatives provide comparable income. Simply banning hunting without offering solutions has consistently failed. Vaccination strategies have also evolved to overcome logistical hurdles. Thermostable vaccines, which can withstand power outages, now protect against diseases like Ebola in remote areas. Ring vaccination plans prioritize high-risk groups first. During the 2020 DRC Ebola outbreak, health workers vaccinated 17,000 people in a 30 kilometers radius around each case within 72 hours. This rapid response was made even more effective by new single-dose regimens, which improve compliance. Previously, 2-week wait periods between doses caused many to skip the second shot, leaving them vulnerable. Surveillance efforts don't stop at human health. 3 types of monitoring work together to catch outbreaks early. Community event-based monitoring tracks unusual illnesses or deaths. Animal health tracking observes primate die-offs and bat migrations. Environmental sampling tests water sources at forest edges. In 2022, a Ugandan program combining all 3 detected Marburg virus in bats months before human cases appeared. This early detection allowed preemptive health messaging in at-risk districts, giving communities a critical head start. Waste management interventions address hidden transmission chains. For example, Needle disposal programs at traditional healer sites in North Kivu reduced syringe reuse by 90%. Special burial teams now handle contaminated materials during outbreaks, a lesson learned after the 2014 Ebola crisis, when virus-laden bedding and clothing reignited transmission weeks later. These measures may seem small, but they close dangerous gaps in outbreak containment. Markets, often bustling hubs of activity, can also be hotspots for disease spread. To address this, concrete dividers now separate high-risk bushmeat sellers from other sections in Congolese markets. Solar-powered freezers allow safer meat storage, reducing the risk of contamination. Vendor cooperatives maintain these improvements collectively, with compliance tied to microloans. Picture a market where safer practices are not just encouraged but built into the infrastructure. This is how change takes root. Each of these strategies, early detection, behavior change, alternative livelihoods, vaccination, surveillance, waste management, and market interventions, plays a vital role in preventing outbreaks. Together, they form a multi-layered defense system that protects communities and saves lives. Building resilience. From vulnerability to preparedness. Central Africa is transforming how it faces disease threats, shifting from reactive crisis response to building systems that prevent outbreaks before they start. This change hasn't happened overnight. Countries that previously waited for international help when Ebola or Mpox struck are now developing local capacity to detect, contain, and survive biological threats. The difference shows in the numbers. Regions with strengthened systems now identify outbreaks 65% faster and contain them with 40% fewer deaths compared to a decade ago. Infrastructure improvements form the backbone of this resilience. 15 years ago, the Democratic Republic of Congo had just one functional biosafety lab capable of testing for dangerous pathogens. Today, a network of diagnostic facilities spans the country, including labs with biosafety level 3 containment. These labs sequence genomes to track mutations, enabling faster responses. During the 2022 Mpox outbreak, Congolese scientists identified a new viral clade within 72 hours of sample collection, a stark contrast to the months-long waits when samples had to be shipped overseas. Isolation units have evolved from makeshift tents to permanent biocontainment wards with negative pressure systems. Uganda's Bwera Regional Referral Hospital built Africa's first permanent Ebola treatment unit after the 2018 outbreak. The facility includes pediatric isolation rooms, on-site lab capacity, and designated areas for survivor counseling. Similar units now operate in 5 high-risk countries, designed to handle multiple outbreak scenarios simultaneously. These always-ready facilities mean suspect cases can be isolated immediately, preventing further spread. Supply chain reforms have also played a critical role. Regional medical warehouses now use drone networks to deliver emergency supplies to remote areas within hours. A pilot program in Equateur Province reduced stockout rates from 83% to 12% by implementing an AI-powered inventory system. This system predicts needs based on disease surveillance data, seasonal patterns, and community utilization rates. During the 2023 diphtheria outbreak, it automatically redirected antibiotics to affected zones before official case reports arrived, ensuring timely intervention. Training programs are creating sustainable local expertise. The Kinshasa School of Public Health now graduates 200 epidemiologists annually, up from just 20 in 2010. Their training emphasizes field deployment, with students spending 6 months in rural surveillance outposts before graduating. Similar programs in Liberia and Sierra Leone focus on mid-level practitioners, turning nurses and lab technicians into outbreak first responders. One innovative Ugandan program cross-trains veterinary and human health workers, recognizing that 75% of emerging diseases originate in animals. Technology adaptations have been pivotal in overcoming geographical and financial constraints. Solar-powered mobile labs mounted in four-wheel drive vehicles can process tests at outbreak epicenters. These units detected the first Marburg cases in Tanzania's 2023 outbreak, while traditional labs were still arranging sample transport. Tablet-based contact tracing systems work offline in forest communities, syncing data when reaching connectivity zones. An AI-assisted diagnostic tool called Nuru, Light in Swahili, helps community health workers assess skin lesions from pox with 92% accuracy using just a smartphone camera. Active surveillance networks provide early warning for threats. The Central Africa Regional Integration for Surveillance Epidemiology, Crises, system links 1,200 sentinel sites across 9 countries. Each site reports unusual health events weekly, whether spikes in fevers or animal die-offs. In 2021, this network detected abnormal mortality in monkey populations 3 months before human pox cases appeared. The system's strength lies in its local roots. Reports come from village health workers who notice changes subtle enough to escape formal diagnostics. International partnerships now prioritize sustainable capacity over short-term fixes. The CDC's long-standing collaboration with DRC illustrates this shift. Instead of deploying American teams during crises, they've trained 850 Congolese disease detectives through a field epidemiology program. Graduates form the backbone of outbreak response. 96% remain working locally compared to foreign consultants who leave post-crisis. Joint projects like the INRB Research Institute in Kinshasa ensure technology transfers remain in-country, eliminating dependency on expensive imports. Vaccine strategies confront logistical realities. Thermostable formulations that withstand power outages now stock regional reserves. New delivery methods overcome cold chain challenges. Lyophilized mpox vaccines can be reconstituted in the field without refrigeration. Ring vaccination campaigns prioritize high-risk groups first. During Uganda's 2022 Ebola outbreak, teams vaccinated 17,000 contacts within 72 hours using these protocols. Community engagement starts months before vaccines arrive, dispelling myths through trusted local leaders. Waste management systems prevent secondary transmission. Needle disposal programs at traditional healer sites reduced syringe reuse by 90% in North Kivu. Special burial teams handle contaminated materials during outbreaks. A lesson learned after the 2014 Ebola crisis showed virus-laden bedding could reignite chains weeks later. Project Safe Sharps installed biohazard containers across Congolese health facilities, cutting needle-stick injuries among workers by 60%. Market-focused interventions disrupt transmission hotspots. Concrete dividers now separate bushmeat vendors from other stalls in Congolese markets to limit cross-contamination. Solar-powered freezers allow safer meat storage without ice shortages. Vendor cooperatives enforce these improvements collectively. Compliance determines access to microloans for alternative livelihoods. Behavioral nudges like colored pathways guide customers past hand-washing stations before entering high-risk sections. Community surveillance bridges the last mile to remote villages. The Red Cross trained 15,000 community-based monitors across 8 countries. These volunteers report unusual events via coded SMS. No smartphone required. Their alerts triggered the first responses to 80% of recent outbreaks in participating regions. When monitors in Sierra Leone noted odd bat behavior weeks before a 2023 Lassa fever cluster, investigators took their observations seriously. Mental health integration recognizes that resilience requires psychological recovery. Post-outbreak clinics now screen survivors for PTSD and depression, conditions found in 48% of Ebola survivors untreated. Peer support networks help grieving communities process loss while maintaining vigilance. In Liberia, memory books, created during counseling sessions, double as epidemiological records, capturing outbreak details that formal reports miss. Financial protections shield households from outbreak-related ruin. The African Risk Capacity Insurance Mechanism paid $8.1 million within 2 weeks of DRC's 2021 Ebola declaration, funds that kept markets open and health workers paid during quarantines. Village savings groups provide emergency loans so families don't sell assets during crises. A pilot program in Uganda links mobile cash transfers to vaccination compliance, demonstrating that economic security boosts prevention uptake. These systems now function like a well-tuned engine, ready to respond seamlessly when crises arise. The transformation shows in metrics beyond case counts. Stockout rates for essential outbreak supplies dropped from 73% to 19% in strengthened systems. Health worker retention in high-risk areas improved 55% after safety upgrades. Community trust scores doubled where locals led response planning. Each contained outbreak preserves economic stability, which funds further preparedness, breaking historical cycles of neglect followed by panic. Challenges remain, particularly in conflict zones where violence disrupts health systems. But the emerging model proves even resource-limited settings can develop multi-layered defenses. When Congolese researchers redesigned protective gear to accommodate traditional healers' ceremonial robes, compliance soared. When Liberian communities developed their own outbreak drill scenarios based on past traumas, participation rates eclipsed internationally designed exercises. This hard-won resilience doesn't eliminate outbreaks. Nature guarantees new threats will emerge, but it fundamentally changes their impact. Where diseases once tore through defenseless populations, strengthened systems now detect, absorb, and adapt to biological shocks. The measure of success isn't zero outbreaks, but communities that survive them with their social and economic fabric intact, and the growing confidence that when the next threat comes, they'll be ready. Central Africa's lethal landscapes reveal a paradox. The most dangerous places to live often foster the most resilient communities. These populations survive through remarkable adaptations to constant biological risks. The key to future outbreak prevention lies in understanding how environmental, social, and medical factors intersect to create vulnerability. Climate change and development are increasing disease risks globally, making Central Africa's hard-won lessons a beacon of hope. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, these communities show how resilience can transform adversity. What can we learn from their strength to prepare for our own challenges? When communities